Today, we're delving into a story that exposes Amazon's corrupt relationship with the Department of Justice and how one of the world's largest and most powerful corporations have weaponized the DOJ to engage in lawfare against its former employees. I'm your host, James Lee, and you're watching Beyond the Headlines on Breaking Points. Imagine having your family's assets seized by the government without ever being charged with a crime. Yeah, they can do that. In the US, civil forfeiture is a legal process that allows law enforcement to seize property from people suspected of involvement in a crime or illegal activity. That's exactly what happened to Carl Nelson, a former Amazon employee whose life and family was turned completely upside down by allegations of financial misconduct. The problem, he was never charged with a crime. And joining us today on the show is Amy Nelson, Carl's wife, who has been on the front lines of this struggle, taking to social media to share their side of the story and expose the potential flagrant misuse of our justice system. Amy, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, James.
Yeah, of course. In getting to know a little bit of your story, I just wanted to start maybe with a background, what your husband did at Amazon prior to all this going down.
Yeah. So my husband, Carl, worked at Amazon Web Services for about 8 years. And AWS is a subsidiary of Amazon, and they build the cloud, the internet. And my husband spent his career in industrial and commercial real estate development, has a master's in real estate development, and he helped Amazon both lease and build warehouses that others turned into data centers.
So then tell me a little bit about the allegations, maybe who was involved with it, when that exactly in the timeline did that go down? So we have a good picture of everything.
Yeah, I think to say what my husband did was perhaps easier than what Amazon said. But my husband had Amazon's original 1990s employment contract. And if we know anything about Jeff Bezos, we know he's, purports to be a libertarian. He's very hands-off. He believes in entrepreneurship and innovation. And in his original 90s employment contract, he allowed his employees to do all sorts of things while they worked at Amazon and after, including starting a business, their own business. And they could seek investment from anyone as long as they weren't an investor in Amazon. They could even work directly with businesses Amazon was working with, so long as the arrangement wasn't substantially similar. And that makes sense, right? Because Jeff Bezos owns multiple businesses that do business together. Amazon just awarded his space company, Blue Origin, like a $10 billion contract. And so my husband, in his last years at Amazon, did start his own business. He set it up. He, set up the legal entity, worked with a lawyer, and sought investment that was all lawyered, in agreement with his employment contract. Then he left Amazon and he started working in commercial real estate development, which is his expertise. And he started working with developers to help them rezone land for data center use, because that is something that is really specialized. Not every piece of land can be used for a data center. You have to have water, power, fiber, all of these things. And then you have to work with the municipalities. So he started helping other real estate developers do that when he left Amazon. And then about 10 months after he had left, on April 2nd, 2020, the FBI knocked on our door in Seattle at around 6:45 a.m. And this is 2 weeks into the pandemic. So it was just a wild time for all of us. I answered the door. I had a baby on my hip. We had 4 little girls who were under 6 at the time. And, the FBI asked to speak to him. And they said, we're here to ask you questions about a real estate developer named Brian Watson. And, I'm a lawyer. And so I said to my husband, you can't talk to them without a lawyer, which nobody should ever talk to any law enforcement without a lawyer. But that kicked off this saga that still is going on today in some ways. I will say my husband was never ultimately charged with a crime, but Amazon alleged that he had, during and after his employment, somehow steered Amazon deals to real estate developers in exchange for kickbacks. And my husband did not do that. And he was never charged. And ultimately, many years of fighting later, a federal judge said that my husband's real estate development work was in compliance with his employment contract. There was no breach of contract, let alone a crime or any fraud or racketeering, which is also what Amazon claimed.
And I also read, so speaking of the FBI and showing up at your door, I was reading a few articles covering your story, and they talked a little bit about something called civil forfeiture. I was wondering if you might want to go into that, where they basically can seize your assets if you are, I guess, potentially involved in a crime. I'm wondering what evidence they had to do that, and what your experience with all of that was.
Yeah, thanks for asking because I think if there's anything that I can take away from this experience, it's that we really need to abolish the practice of civil forfeiture in America. And I'll be honest and say I didn't even know it existed, which I think is a function of my privilege in America because civil forfeiture impacts so many folks across the country. But in America, local, state, and federal government can seize your assets, your money, your home, car, on the suspicion that the asset is related to a crime. They don't have to charge you with a crime. They don't have to prove a crime. And you don't have a right to a timely hearing to try to prove your innocence. And the burden is on you to prove that your asset is innocent. The reason they can do all of this, it's really a legal fiction in America, but your bank account doesn't have due process like you do. And so they can just take your things. And they're also, I would also say that law enforcement is incentivized to take your things because if they take your things and your money and you don't hire lawyers and fight to get it back, they get to keep it. And so if you think about how police forces, if you think about how the FBI, like the funding that they have, a lot of it comes from taking Americans' things. Um, and for me, it's like if you show me the incentive, I'll show you the result, right? Like if you're going to have civil forfeiture, don't let the people who are taking the things keep it because they'll just keep taking things. Now, just the wildest part of this, James, is that this civil forfeiture for us happened in May of 2020, and the government actually took all of our bank accounts. We had 4 little girls, and they took my money because my husband sometimes wired me money. So they like went into his bank account, and then they were like, "Where is his money going? We're taking all that too." They took money my husband had paid to lawyers from a law firm client trust account. Um, they took my father's money because my father, who was 2 weeks post kidney transplant, was very, very ill and almost died, and we helped him financially. Um, and after they took it, I will tell you, the prosecutors said to my husband's lawyers, "Well, if he just pleads guilty to Amazon's allegations, we'll give some of it back so you can feed your kids." The
That sounds
most
like
impossible.
extortion almost a little bit.
Well, I mean, it is. And I think like another thing I've learned through this process is that prosecutors are allowed to extort you. They're allowed to lie, they're allowed to do all sorts of things, which is just like it's not justice, it's bullying, and, like, I can't imagine how any prosecutor would feel good about doing that. But, anyway, with civil forfeiture, they took everything, and they took it pursuant to warrants. They have to get a warrant to take your things with a probable cause affidavit that they got from a judge. But we've never seen the warrant or the affidavit. This happened in 2020. We got our money back, 85% of it, so long as we promised not to sue the government in 2022. Um, but we've still never been able to see the allegations through which they took our money. Those documents were supposed to be unsealed on April 1st, 2024. But the government has now asked the court to seal them forever. So we can never see the allegations under which they took our money.
Yeah, I find that to be a little bit disturbing. But so in terms of just getting the overall story, I'm wondering, in terms of the overall timeline, you mentioned that the FBI showed up at your doorstep after your husband had already left the job at Amazon. So I'm wondering why Amazon, or I don't know if you have any insight into this, I'm sure you do. Why did Amazon feel the need to go after your husband?
Yeah, I mean, this is something like we spent years untangling, and it was really hard to figure out. And frankly, the only reason we did figure all of it out is because Amazon sued my husband in civil court too, and that case went into discovery, which is the exchange of information. What we learned in civil discovery is that this related to a set of data centers we'll call the North Star data centers. Amazon was leasing these data centers from a joint venture between a real estate developer named Brian Watson, who had a company called North Star, and a capital partner, the money guys, named IPI. IPI is Iron Point Iconic. Iron Point is Robert Bass's fund, and Iconic is the family office of like Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, and others. So a lot of billionaires over there. IPI wanted to build its own data centers and not have a real estate development partner, and they wanted a relationship with Amazon. So they bought a real estate development company called Stack, and then they tried to get Brian Watson out of these deals with Amazon. They tried to buy him out. He didn't want to be bought out. But the contract between Brian Watson and IPI said that if Brian Watson was convicted of or pled guilty to a felony, he was out of the data centers. And what we know now is that IPI went to Amazon, said that Brian Watson was paying a kickback to this guy, Christian Kirshner, who then paid it to my husband. So my husband would steer Brian Watson deals. And then Amazon, without any investigation, and IPI together hired former federal prosecutors from the Eastern District of Virginia to lobby their former colleagues, still at the Eastern District of Virginia, for criminal charges. IPI broke the contract with Brian Watson in secret on February 19th, 2020. Their first meeting with the DOJ was on February 20th, 2020. Without getting a felony, IPI will probably owe Brian Watson hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, because these deals are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And Amazon got involved in helping IPI break the contract. Why? I have no idea. Frankly, I think they got hoodwinked by IPI. Like, I think I think they're just so big, and IPI came to them with these sensational allegations, and Amazon just said, okay, we're with you, and jumped.
And in some ways, or some would say that they didn't maybe expect the fight that went on afterwards, because I did understand that some of the names that you mentioned, some folks did plead guilty almost right away, which is, I think, maybe what they were hoping for. And also, I read recently, I think this was at the beginning of the year, the DOJ actually vacated the guilty pleas of, was it everybody that was involved in this case, or just some of the folks? But I understand that's kind of an anomaly that they would do something like
Yeah.
that.
There's one nuance I think is important that I think a lot of people don't understand when you're talking about guilty pleas and charges. Because my husband was pressured to plead guilty for years, and people were like, well, when was he charged before he was pressured to plead guilty? And in America, like 92% or 98% of people who are accused of a federal crime plead guilty, because taking it to trial costs millions of dollars. There's a trial penalty. Like, the DOJ will actually try to put you in prison for longer if you don't plead and make them go to trial and prove the case. Um, and but the thing is that people plead guilty before they're charged. And so then it's all a negotiation of what you plead guilty to, et cetera. So my husband was never charged with a crime, and nobody was charged with a crime. But four men who didn't work at Amazon did plead guilty to Amazon's allegations. They all pled guilty to helping my husband criminally violate his employment terms. But if you remember, but all of the men, they'd never seen my husband's employment contract. They didn't know what Amazon's employment terms were. And so when we proved in the civil case that my husband had adhered to the terms of his contract, I know that the judge reached out to the prosecutors and said, what are you going to do about these guilty pleas? Because, the facts aren't right. Like, this guy didn't violate his employment terms. So how could these people have criminally helped him violate the employment terms? And so the Department of Justice ended up dismissing two pleas and vacating two pleas. And if you know anything about the Department of Justice, they are not in the business of telling people who have agreed to go to prison that they don't have to. I can't think of any other example of a criminal investigation in history where four pleas have been dismissed or vacated. I don't think that there is one. But the pressure is very real. And what I've come to learn, because I've spoken to many, many people who have been through the gauntlet of the federal criminal system, many people plead guilty who don't think they've committed any crime. And in fact, one of the men who did plead guilty, who had his plea vacated, Kyle Ramstetter, he called me after the pleas were vacated, and he told me that my husband had done nothing wrong, that he had wanted to fight, but he couldn't, that he was threatened with everything in his life, and that he was told what to say. And just hearing that it was validating on the one hand, but it's horrifying, right? It's this whole experience, and it's not justice. And I have to think, we survived a fight because my husband and I have high earning power. I'm a lawyer. My father-in-law is a lawyer. We were able to move in with family after we had to sell our house to pay lawyers. But very, very few people have the ability to do any or all of those things. And most of those people don't even have a chance to fight. How many people are in prison or jail in America that shouldn't be there at all?
I want to jump to ask you about, I know you've been pretty vocal online about this over the last couple of years. And I think the majority of the responses that I've seen are very positive and supportive, and also kind of taken aback by your experience and your husband's experience through all of this. But I did see one, on Reddit that was a little bit more of a pushback, where you got I think much less sympathy. You know, the reaction was kind of like, well, look at this. This is a millionaire fighting a billionaire. You know, you guys are doing commercial real estate, which is in it of itself more of a shady type of business. You're not exactly the perfect victim. That's kind of the vibe that I got, was like, okay, you know, cry me a river kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
You know, what would your, you know, I was wondering what your takeaway, uh, what was your takeaway from that exchange that
Yeah.
I saw on Reddit? Because I know you were actually back and forth with some of these people who are posting anonymously on Reddit.
Yeah. No, and I'm not afraid to like answer questions. We aren't perfect victims. We're part of the 1%. I would say we're even today, working very hard and rebuilding our lives. We're part of the 1%. And commercial real estate is an unregulated business that can seem shady from the get-go. Um, and, I get it. And I think the idea of a perfect victim is a fantasy. When I think about it, I think to, women who are brave enough, who have been sexually assaulted, and they're brave enough to come forward, and people look at their sexual pasts and try to delegitimize the fact of the truth of what happened to them because they'd had sex before with someone else. And the hardest part for me when people, say, well, we have no sympathy for you because you had money going into this, et cetera. I'm not asking for sympathy. What we're asking for is that Americans have their eyes open to what bad actors can use the Department of Justice and the courts to do to Americans. My husband had every right to start a company. He had every right to chase his piece of the American dream, and to have someone come and literally try to put him in prison for it, and for us to have to spend millions of dollars to prove his innocence. Like, if that's the process for people in the 1%, with the alleged perpetrator, his wife is a lawyer, and like, what chance does anybody else have? And so, my belief is that, and part of the reason we talk about the story online is that we can use this platform to drive change. And that is the benefit of having, of me being an entrepreneur and a lawyer, that I already had this public profile. And so if I can take that and shine a light on something that generally happens to people that don't look like me, I'm going to do it. Right. And maybe Congress will open their doors to me more readily than other people, but I'm okay not being a perfect victim. I'm not a perfect person. Like, my husband isn't either. And I still think that we deserve constitutional rights. And I still think what Amazon did was wrong. And so, and also, like, I'll say this, and I think this is a big part of it. Like, people will be like, well, what he did was shady or something. You know what? The way the law works, you don't get to put people in prison for doing shady things. You put people in prison, if you prove that they committed a crime that they had fair notice of, that they understood the law of. And that's what we should want the law to be, right? Like, we do not want people with access to be able to say, I'm going to make up these crimes, or, X, Y, or Z, just put people that I don't like, that are my competitors, that I don't want to be out there in the world operating, in prison. And so I'll take the negative. My dad always says, if everybody likes you, you're not doing it right. And so I understand that this can be controversial, but I think it's important. I also think, a long time ago, I realized that my 4 daughters were going to grow up and read about this. And when you're accused of a crime, journalists generally just repeat the allegations. And they write articles and they repeat the allegations. Like, when the DOJ indicts someone, they have a press conference about the allegations. Like, if you talk about it as a defendant, you could be like, you could go to prison for witness tampering, but the DOJ can have a press conference. And so, the narrative in the world was Amazon's allegations. And we didn't have an issue with sharing the truth. And my husband's lawyer was like, it's the truth. Go ahead and say it out loud. It's not an issue. You don't have to be quiet. And I knew that my girls were going to grow up and read about this. And I want them to see that we fought. And I want them to see that we didn't like bow down to bullies, and that their dad stood with integrity and didn't lie and didn't falsely implicate anyone.
Yeah, there's a saying I really like, which is the truth is always a defense. Anyway, in terms
Yeah.
of just kind of wrapping up our conversation, I just wanted to ask you sort of what's next, or if people want to find out more information about your case, where can people find that? Or maybe it's your page, where can people find, more of what you have to say?
Yeah, I would love for people to follow our story on my TikTok channel, which is at Amy_K_Nelson. There hasn't been a deep dive in the corporate media about our story. But I hope that there will be eventually. I hope a journalist, an intrepid journalist, takes it on. Sometimes we need journalists in corporate media to stand up If you look at Harvey Weinstein, it wasn't until Ronan Farrow said no more and broke the story of Me Too that the world changed, a watershed moment. And you have built an incredible platform, and so many people have. But I think in the corporate media, eventually someone will investigate this.
I hope so. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Amy, to share your story, your husband's story. I wish you and your family the best going forward.
Thanks so much, James.
That is it for me today. If you want more stories that the mainstream media is unwilling to tell, please check out and subscribe to my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee. The link will be in the description below. As always, thank you for your time today, and keep on tuning into Breaking Points.